The gods we serve are evident by our own thoughts and actions. Do you really want to know the nature of the gods you worship? By understanding Plato's theory of forms and the human tendency to make personified ideas holy, we can look at our society and its recent roots to know the young gods. The young gods who rule us, and the gods whom they supplanted. Are you sure that you want to rip the veil to see the face of the gods you worship? I must warn you to think twice before supplanting your own comfortable religious notions. But if you would like to proceed ahead, let's tarry no longer. Who are the gods you serve? Ancient light. The main point of this episode is to talk about Plato's theory of forms and the ancient practice of holy personification. I've attempted to explain a strange topic in a relatable way. Here's an experiment. I want you to think about the modern world, but in ancient terms. We will use Plato and personification to begin to build our religious scaffolding. First, let us explore the two concepts before we just race off and begin indiscriminately creating new gods, which is our intended goal. First, Plato's forms. Everything you see and know are merely reflections and repercussions of a larger master essence, which is a pure and interconnected embodiment of a particular physical or mental quality, usually explained as an idea. So objects and people are influenced by smaller essences which reside in themselves, are in itself, and these smaller essences are just a tiny part of the larger main essence or form of that specific idea or quality. So for a certain type of love, there is a super form, which would be a storehouse of sorts of anything and everything related to that particular type of love. And so from that super form, the quality of love is emitted, according to Plato's idea of forms. So what you can do to help you understand that is you can pick any idea, imagine it as a pure form or like an uber essence, which feeds its influence into material reality and into your mind, into idea. But this form, this master form, this super form, this uber essence, it's not physical. But it's also not merely a product of the mind, according to Plato. So once you realize what Plato was talking about, it's actually a pretty cool idea. I mean, we're taking any essence that you can think of, maybe like a general essence like war, like I said, love, a general essence, lust. How about the general essence of music? How about the general essence of politics, party politics? How about the general essence of terrorism? That sort of thing. I mean, if you're thinking along those lines, then you're on the right track. And so you would imagine a sort of non-physical idea cluster somewhere, essentially what we'd call floating in space. But if it's non-physical, then it's debatable whether it can exist in space, I guess. I don't know. But, it's an old idea from Plato. I mean, come on. But it's a cool idea that's influenced a lot of thought. So finally, let's talk about personification, or sometimes I call it, to be specific, holy personification. Personification is when you assign a personality to a quality. So it's very similar to Plato's forms in its application. So when we look at a god in history, which is an embodiment of a human emotion or a state, much like, the use of anthropomorphism, we could even say that personification, holy personification, is an anthropomorphism of the idea of Plato's forms in general. You can the two kind of work together in one theoretical plane, at least. And so personification is just like from the time of Homer, with the Iliad and the Odyssey, you have Eros, which is actually a personification of love, right? Eros, love. That's in the time of Homer, So into the future, into the classical era of Greece, you had sort of a resurgence of personification of, and particularly Eros, in the late classical era, with sort of the new type of red inlay pottery the Athenians were using. You had a sort of a market shift, so to speak, towards women's domestic items, and you began seeing, Eros aiding Aphrodite in womanly things like having a child and that sort of thing. So you saw the reemergence of personification in the late classical era, and there are other examples of that too. But then after the classical era, you have the Hellenistic era, then the Roman era. The idea of holy personification began to expand greatly in the Hellenistic era. And so by then, by the Hellenistic and Roman eras, there were actual shrines and priests dedicated to the worship of a personified deity, like victory or fortune or liberty or, again, the older ones, love. So even some of the Olympian gods were appropriated as personifications. I've already talked about the Aphrodite, and of course to the Romans Venus. They become the embodiment of love. And Aphrodite wasn't necessarily, in its pre-Greek form, the goddess of love. She had other attributes, But now Aphrodite and Venus are kind of own love in a way. And Eros is the son of Aphrodite, or a helper of Aphrodite at least. And then, of course, war. You have Ares, or Mars, the Roman Mars, who take war. And they're the god of war. So that's kind of a brief summary of Plato's forms and holy personification. I think they're really neat concepts. So in the last part of this show, there will be a metered poem. And it's really only an excerpt from a larger work titled Young Gods. It has a lot of information packed into it, and occasionally the obscure reference, but it explores this concept in depth from a speculative fiction perspective. Fiction affords certain liberties which allows one to explore a concept with an enhanced amount of freedom. The poem that I'm going to read, the excerpt, ties the idea of Plato's forms to that of the gods, modern gods. We're applying the ancient concept to modern times. But that's not a new concept, considering the ancient tendency toward personification and the modern tendency in literature and media. For example, even Oprah said that God is love and love is God, And perhaps she's not speaking of Eros or any kind of erotic love, but maybe more like a godly agape love, and maybe she's talking about a combination of the two, I'm not sure. But also think about modern fiction authors who use personification of human phenomena and make them into gods, such as Neil Gaiman's Sandman series. We had a personification of Dream, who looked like Robert Smith, right? We had a personification of Death, who was very sexy. And then we had a Delirium, who looked a lot like Cyndi Lauper. So, interestingly, here's an idea. So what if we went ahead, and you can do this as well, I encourage you to do that, what if we went ahead and applied our knowledge of Plato's theory of forms with ancient religious personification to our own modern world? We would have to begin to look, almost retroactively, at dominant changes in our civilization, and look at modern trends to determine the nature of our gods. Now, of course, I don't really mean we're identifying real gods. This is an exercise in the two concepts that I'm covering in this show, personification and Plato's theory of forms. It's a neat, easy way to learn it, to get over that learning curve, and to really start playing around with these ancient concepts. So, the mode of investigation that I'm talking about when it comes to the exercise of identifying our, quote, modern gods, therefore is best served by what's called the phenomenological method. Like philosophers like Martin Heidegger. He's a celebrated German philosopher and a once member of the Nazi Party. He eventually found his objective phenomenological method best served by analyzing literary works, especially poetry. In poetry in particular, a method of objective phenomenology, in other words, poetry allows a person to explore ideas without the immediate conventional cultural labels which so conveniently allow humans to effortlessly interact with their contemporaries in their society, in their environment, and throughout their day. It's sort of a social lubricant to follow conventional cultural labels. Well, poetry puts you on the outside of that a little bit without clinging to immediate labels, of, say, rebel or savior or hero or what have you. You play around with more amorphous ideas. So, poetry is a slight bypass of the conventional, but it always returns to the conventional so it can appeal to the audience. So the reader is then given a glimpse of their own situation from a creative or outside interpretation. It's both refreshing and conventional to the audience, being reflective in itself, a poem that is. So then, if we look at our own culture, our habits, our enterprises, our skirmishes, we can then personify those major forces and call them each a god of man. With that said, what gods can you identify? I feel like this is a very good question which may spark some interesting commentary below. The god of war, for example, is not the same god of war in the pre-modern era as he is in the current era. So, how has he, she, or it changed? War, through history, becomes more deadly and cold as military technology advances. Our heroes of myth and empire are efficient and often trend-setting murderers. With this idea of identifying the modern living gods who have supplanted the old gods, and using Plato's theory of forms and personification, we're going to look and identify modern phenomena and try to identify what gods are working behind the scenes. So so once again, we're looking at the modern world from a conceptual ancient standpoint, using personification and Plato's theory of forms. So here begins a fitting excerpt from the poem Young Gods. It's pretty dense, but there's some ideas in there that might pass on and help work out this idea of Plato and personification. Young Gods. A well-known god is known through the ages. New gods born as old gods needs forgotten. Even the offspring of a god and human are born then die a final breath goodbye. But the children of the union of gods can only rise and descend, never die. The immortals, once born, never vacant, but after their turn home is in Hades, roaming the back of the minds of mortal, shadow of the active gods of the earth, young gods defining the state of the age. As the long-lived can tell you this one truth, the bastards of gods born from mortal womb, Heracles, Percy, Alex, and the Christ, saw the old Zeus once young, once purveyor, our Olympic heritage from his sire. Zeus, long gone from mortal realm, remembered, his corpse named Jupiter, now well preserved. During the rise of the strong Roman hand, and so they did to the corpse of the Christ, once martyred man Jesus, now sovereign, images of old gods used as puppets. The operator moves the lips and speaks, the deathly appearance not out of place. When the paint fades from the eyes of Greek statue, the image conveys a gaze of blank stare. Not to ramble on about Zeus once young, but must needs him so you can soon relate, ushered in the demise of old Kronos, the old gods who bore their own replacement. Homer in his time tells of Zeus in prime, the days of the blind poet would never see. Old thunderbolt on Olympus skyline, for Mount Ida reared god-burying Zeus, had long descended as man found rust, and melted it into swords and the plow. Old kings turned over in ancient dark age, His offspring Ares spread war and grew large. But who told the humans that Zeus was gone? Even the gods know the truth of worship. The religion of mortals always behind. They advance as a whole with the new gods, having only known the names of the old. Apollo and Perseus wander the realm free, smelling the perfume of the sacrifice. No matter the name attached to the smoke, the sounds and scent arouse the active gods. Is this sacrifice all that they require? One may be well informed to know our task. The new god bids change and we rearrange. To know the living gods, look around. What law dominates? What new advancement? What conflicts loom? What new plow to till the earth? How are humans defying nature now? Therein lies the study of the new gods.